Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, this is the 7th webinar from Code, I think the first one of 2015, so that's pretty exciting. And we're going to talk about the hot topic of the new spinal orthoses regulations and rules and that sort of thing, and what's going on with that, and all the audits that are happening with the spinal orthoses. As far as who I am, just a quick bio. My name is Molly McCoy, as you see there, and my company is McCoy Consulting. And my affiliation with SPS is that they have hired me and my little company to run their code program that they have for SPS customers. So code has several different aspects. One of them is these webinars, so that's one aspect, which is nice. And the other one is, I think, the more exciting one, or the more interesting and different, is the hands-on help. So what I do through Code is for SPS customers, you can send in to me your documentation on patients, and I will review it, critique it, rewrite it, and send it back to you. Oh, and my background, obviously, I'm a CPO, been in P&O for over 20 years. I was in practice, and then I taught at UW, lower extremity prosthetics at University of Washington for a while, and now my own company. So quick background on me. If you have any questions about me later, you can email. But okay, let's dive into this. What in the world happened with spinal orthoses? As we know, there have been some changes in the regulations, and they're also enforcing regulations that have been on the books for a while. And we're talking about Medicare here, just to be clear. But let's look at some of the audits that that came through from the different MACs. Here's one from NHIC, which is, this is pretty recent one. This is Jurisdiction A MAC. And as you can see here, the denial rates went up from 2013 at about 77%. And in late 2014, we're at 87.6%. So what the heck? All of a sudden, there were all these denials, and what changed is the question, right? And then here's one from National Government Services, NGS. They show a similar issue. Their numbers are really appalling at about 97%. That's insane denial rate. Super painful. Those numbers were terrible from NGS. And then we have Noridian, who did a similar review for spinal orthoses, and they came up with 98%. So painful. I mean, that's such a huge denial rate. And in my mind, when I see these denial rates, I'm thinking, yes, the regulations have changed, but it hasn't been an earth-shattering change. Who did this, right? Was this all P&O having these kind of terrible results, or could something else have been going on? So let's talk about that too. Who is billing spinal orthoses, and who's messing up, right? Is it us or is it them? And we'll look at that. And then what are the new requirements? We're going to go into that. What's the order of operations? This one's a biggie. It's a little bit confusing. Actually, I think it's a lot confusing, the order of operations issue. And it's something that is, while it seems like a small thing, getting things in the right order, it actually can be extremely difficult because it's totally different than how we've typically run our practices in the past. So we're going to spend some time on that one. What does the orthotist chart and what's the doctor chart, and how can you help the doctor chart what you need? We're going to go through that as well. So moving right along, who is causing all these audits to look so nasty? Who is causing this 98% denial rate? Of course, it's everyone. Everyone that's billing for spinal has had some issues, and we know P&O denials for spinal are definitely up there. We definitely get them. However, again, I would say 98% doesn't seem like all P&O to me. So I went looking for percentages. What's the percentage of denials that came from non-P&O providers, and what's the percentage that came from P&O? And I couldn't find that number specifically. If anybody out there has that number or has seen it, I'd love to get a copy of it, but I couldn't find that particular number. What I did find was an OIG report from 1997. This isn't the OIG report you've been hearing so much about from 2011 that started all this craziness. This is a much older one from 97. At that time, what they showed, or what they saw, was that more questionable billing in orthotics was coming from durable medical equipment suppliers than it was from orthotists. So that's interesting. Way back in 97, CMS was recognizing that there was a problem more in DME than in orthotics. So that was kind of an interesting stat. Also, we can pretty much count on these similar numbers currently, that orthotists account for around 43% of orthotics supplied, DME companies account for 50%, and the remaining 7 are your doctor, pharmacy, rehab center kind of thing. Now, of course, those are different from now than they were in 97, but in general, that gives you a pretty decent idea. It gets you in a ballpark figure, about half and half for orthotists versus DME, right? And then this is another thing that report said. And again, I find this interesting that back in 97, they noticed, CMS noticed that if they have guidelines on and requirements on how to fit and what to fit for certain orthoses, that they were less likely to have denials on those orthoses. And they found that, most of those denials were coming from DME companies, but if they gave them more strict guidelines, they could decrease those denials for DME. So that's interesting too. I just thought I'd throw it in there because, note that, the DME companies who don't specialize in orthotics necessarily are having all these issues. So Medicare says, oh, we'll help them by tightening up the requirements and not requiring as much thought, right? Not requiring as much expertise basically to fit it. So interesting thing. And then currently, what's the rate of kind of issues or denials, and what's the percentage? This is a more recent report, 07. So again, not yesterday, not super current, but more current, the most current that I could find, truthfully. So what does that show? In this report from 2007, this is the improper Medicare fee-for-service payments report, and again from 2007. Okay, and what that showed was, interestingly, here's us in yellow, right? These are medical supply company with orthotic personnel certified, individual certified orthotist, individual certified prosthetist, etc. Those numbers are really pretty low, right? If you look at the denial rates for our group, it's a pretty decent number, it's not great. We're still in the double digits there, so it's not ideal, but it's not terrible. If we look up here at the medical supply company other, right, and then the unknown supplier provider, so whatever that is, but basically not us, then you see those denial rates are much, much higher. So again, just along the lines of, I'm not trying to say orthotists aren't messing up at all. I'm just saying those huge numbers, like 98% denial rate on a spinal, might not reflect what's happening as much in P&O, and it reflects more the larger group of people who are fitting and delivering spinal orthoses. So we still have room to improve, and we're going to do that. But it helps a little bit. At least I felt like it helped to know that other people are messing this up much more frequently than we are, and much worse. And unfortunately, because we're lumped in with DME, we're getting scrutinized as well because of mistakes made. So let's talk about what we can do to improve to make sure that our denial rates go down in the P&O realm. Now that we know that, hey, we're going to have a lot of audits, things are not looking so good as far as billing. So let's get prepared and make sure that, at least for us in P&O, we're writing the correct things and getting the good documentation in there. What are these new requirements? What are they asking for? They're pretty confusing if you've looked at them. I mean, they're understandable, but you really have to sit down and kind of review them. And again, like I've said so many times before, I would say this is not just the domain of the front office staff. P&O practitioners, certified practitioners, or whoever's actually seeing the patient should understand these requirements as well, because it really informs how you interact with the patient, and it informs what your notes say, and it informs what information you get from doctors, etc. So it's really important that we as practitioners know this stuff as well. So there's two different areas, or three different types of orthoses you can fit: off the shelf, custom fit, or custom fab. Off the shelf and custom fit are both going to be prefabricated, and they actually can be the same brace, but the difference is in how they're fit. So if it's an off-the-shelf brace, no expert is needed. It's basically, here's your package, small, medium, and large, take it with you, right? Or here's some instructions. If it's custom fit, we need an expert to fit it. And there has to be substantial modification to say that it's custom fit. So what is substantial? We're going to have a whole slide on that coming up. How do we document what substantial modification is? And then who's the expert? Orthotists are the expert. Orthotists, prosthetists, P&O folks are the expert. And we need to just explain why it took an expert to fit this. What about the patient or what about the situation required an expert? So we're going to talk about how you can chart this properly coming up here. And then the last category is obviously custom fabricated. And that we'll talk about in detail how to chart this and how to note that it's custom fabricated. But really, we just need to differentiate it for the reviewer at Medicare and make sure they understand that custom fabricated starts with a basic material, like a sheet plastic. We're going to provide a list of those materials to that reviewer so that they know this is not something that came out of a box ready to go. And then we're going to obviously describe what makes it custom. We cast the person. We measured them in detail. There was a fabrication process. How did the fitting go? Just stuff like that. And again, we'll talk about details on how you can do that, how you can document that well and clearly for the reviewer, not using our P&O jargon, but really make it clear for that reviewer so they understand what happened and why it's custom or why it's custom fit. The order of operations, I'm going to slow way down here because this one is a little confusing. So I want to make it very clear what we're talking about here. The order of operations is literally what order you get the information for the patient and for the brace, and what order you treat the patient or take care of them or deliver the brace, what have you. So if this is an off-the-shelf orthosis, the order of operations for you would be that you get a prescription, right? And then you get doctor's notes. Notice that you don't get a prescription, see the patient, then ask for doctor's notes. This is a really key point. It's really important with everything that we do, but especially right now with everything being so scrutinized with spinal, it's really important that we get a prescription, receive doctor's notes to review that there is information that we need, proper information that's written correctly. And we're going to talk about what that is coming up as well, what the doctor needs to write. Once you see that it's written correctly and it has the information you need, then you see the patient. If you get the prescription and then you see the patient and then you ask the doctor for notes and the notes aren't correct and you ask them to change the notes or add to the notes or what have you, those notes aren't as powerful. If that's all you have, use that. That's what you have to do. But if you want this thing to go through without a hitch and pass on medical review and pass any audit, then you need to make sure the notes are done correctly before you see the patient at all. Huge thing. Really weird and different from what we're used to, especially when I know if you're like me, your first thought is, but the doctor has no idea what he's talking about, especially when it comes to the different type of orthoses. That is true. And we just have to educate them more. And I don't say that flippantly. I know that's not easy as well. It's really difficult to get them educated. We'll talk about that though, maybe have some tricks here to help you get them educated on what to write. The other thing is a custom fitted or custom fabricated brace. There's an order of operations there too, and it's similar. You get a prescription from the doctor. You get the doctor's notes. And what you're probably going to see is that the doctor's notes are not good enough. They don't have the information you need, especially by these new requirements where they want a lot of detail. They want specifics about why it's custom fit versus custom fab or off the shelf and all this sort of stuff. So what you're probably again going to see is that they're deficient. So now you need to educate the doctor, send the patient back and say, could you see this patient again and write notes that I can use? Of course, you're not going to say it in a smart aleck way like that. That would be bad. So, and likewise, if you get a call from a therapist or from a rehab center, it says, oh, the doctor mentioned that he wants a brace, or the therapist says, I've been seeing this patient needs a brace. What we would often do is run over there, fit the brace, or at least measure or see the patient or evaluate. And then what you might even do is fit the brace and then call the doctor and say, hey, I need some notes on this. Or you might say, you might evaluate the patient on the PT's recommendation and then call the doctor and say, I need a script, and then move forward. That's still not going to be ideal for you. That could cause some problems. And often denials come from not having the doctor be the gatekeeper. The doctor has to be the one that initiates the work. So if the PT calls you, ideally, and says, hey, I think this guy needs a spinal brace, your ideal response is then you need to call the doctor, have the doctor write a script and some notes, have the doctor evaluate for the brace, write that up. Then I'm going to come in and fit the brace. Tough thing to take. That's hard to take because that really does mess with how we are used to running our practices, but it's something to think about. Here, over here on the side of the screen, and this is little, but it's in your handouts. I just wanted to sort of give you a representation of it, is a little guideline. If you want to use this as is, feel free. You want to put your company name on it or whatever you want to do, or I'm in the handout, it's a Word document, so you can cut and paste it or change it up if you want. But this is basically a short guideline for your doctors to say what has to be in those notes. And I base this on the Dear Physician letter, the LCD for spinal, and some other documents like the program integrity manual, that kind of thing. So that's where this information comes from, but I'm trying to put it in a really short, easy to read format because I'm sure in your experience, if you give them that a ridiculous long Dear Physician letter, they're not going to read it, they're not going to understand it, and they don't have time for that. So hopefully this is maybe a shortened version that you can run through quickly with your doctors and say, look, this is the stuff that I got to have in there, or Medicare is not going to pay for this, and then the patient's on the hook. So, or you're on the hook, which isn't good either. Okay, so you would educate the doctor at this point, right? You get those doctor's notes, they're terrible. You educate the doctor, give him this little form, send the patient back. The patient sees the doctor again. He writes all this stuff in there now. Now, your next step is that you can see the patient at this point, right? Because then you're going to get those doctor's notes back. They're going to have this information, and then you can see the patient. Okay. Just to further cement that point and to make it clear, I'm not making this stuff up, right? If you look at the LCD for spinal orthoses, what you'll see in there is that it says that the initial justification of medical need has to be established for a spinal, has to be established by the physician, the treating physician, at the time the item is first ordered. And that has to be in the medical record prior to or at the time of the initial prescription. So what that means for you is going back for doctor's notes after the patient has been seen by you and fit, or even just evaluated, can lead to claim denial. So that's a big deal. You might say, well, gosh, I have these great notes. I talked to the doctor. He gave me all this excellent information. But if the note comes after your note of evaluation and fitting, and then you have a doctor's note 2 days later that has all the information you need, that's not in the correct order. Now, is that 100% guarantee of claim denial? Not necessarily, but it is certainly a reason to deny a claim and something that you really want to think about in getting these denial rates down. What does the doctor chart? What does the doctor need to put in their notes, right, to get this done properly? It's all in there. Again, you have that little handout, but they just need to give you the basics. What is the indication for the orthosis? This isn't super difficult stuff to put in there. It's just they don't know what to put. Off the shelf or custom fit, they need to explain, do they want off the shelf or custom fit? And again, that can't be just on the prescription. It's also got to be in their notes. And let me pause here. There's a question. How about acute patients who require a fracture brace immediately? So that one actually I find is a little easier because then you know that the doctor is the gatekeeper on that. So that, if someone's in the ER and they need a spinal brace, they have been seen by at least one physician, and at least one of those physicians has said, we need to stabilize this person and get a brace on them. And then you go in the ER and you fit that, you've got doctor's notes most likely. The weirdness happens when the person is, say, in a rehab unit later. And again, like I said before, the therapist decides that the person needs a brace, or the doctor throws it out there to the therapist but doesn't write anything down. Those kind of things are where it gets a little more fishy. So I don't know how you guys have had it happen in your practices, but I found that usually in the emergency room, you've got, or in a very acute situation, you've got doctor's notes because the doctor is the one making the call. It's really when the therapist or other or nurses or something get involved and decide they need an orthosis, that's when it gets muddied. So getting back to those doctor's notes, it can't be just on the prescription. It has to be in the notes. And again, if you look back, let me back up here if I can, to this little form. And again, I apologize, it's small. What it says here is that the patient, it'll give them reasons for custom fit versus custom made. So often what happens is with the doctors, they're saying, I don't know if it should be off the shelf or custom fit or custom made. That's your job. You're the orthotist. And that's true. But now Medicare is saying, no, doctor, it's your job. So we have to go with that, right? And so this little form, and again, you can make your own, however you want to word it, but keep it, if you can, to the LCD or to the Medicare guidelines. But the little form will say something like the patient needs an off-the-shelf brace because they're standard size, no anatomical weirdness, that kind of thing. So you just need to give the doctor some guidelines on what is custom fit versus off-the-shelf, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also need the doctor to mention why it shouldn't be prefabricated. If they're looking for custom, they just need to say, patient needs it for a long time, they have non-standard anatomy, we've tried prefab in the past, anything like that. Again, with some education, hopefully some quick education, the doctors can be better at writing what needs to be in the notes. Okay, but having said all that, whether this is a small amount of information for the doctor to write or not, this is a jagged little pill, right? And the reason it is, I recognize, is because, again, educating doctors is no small task, is not easy at all. And unfortunately, there is just no getting around the doctor's note requirement, and there's no getting around the fact that the doctor has to write the note before you see the patient, right? So, it's just going to make it tougher. It's just going to make it that much tougher for everybody to get the notes they need. And it definitely is going to make your patients potentially angry because they have to wait or they have to see the doctor more than once. It could make your doctors angry. But again, this is Medicare's, new guidelines. And hopefully, you have the opportunity to show the patient, look, here are the regulations. I didn't make this up. I don't want you to have to do this. But this is what Medicare wants in order to be able to pay for this. So if you want it covered, this is what we have to do. And often once the patient understands that those are the requirements, they can be their own advocate and go back to the doctor and explain, I really need you to write this or that, right? So, okay. So that was a tough one. I know order of operations is hard to hear because it does kind of put a crimp in our style there, kind of makes it difficult compared to what we're used to. But let's move on to what the orthotist actually needs to write in the chart notes. It looks really similar, right? Because it's the same. You have to write everything that the doctor writes as well. So you also have to write the indication for the orthosis. You also have to write off the shelf or custom fit and what type. And then you also have to support why custom made is needed versus prefab. So you're going to write all that stuff as well. But of course, you're writing it from the perspective of the orthotist, which means you're going to explain the type of orthosis and why that works as a custom fit orthosis and what you do to it. And then we need to get some information in there about the actual physical characteristics of these orthoses, which often is missing from our notes, right? Even if this device is listed in PDAC, which supposedly means they reviewed the device and they understand what it's made of, it's really important that you link that to a functional outcome. So is it rigid or semi-rigid? What does that rigidity mean? So if you have a doctor who's saying, we really need a brace to reduce pain. Well, then you're going to say, here's a rigid brace that is going to eliminate motion and therefore control pain. Describe the force and the counterforce. These are words from Medicare's LCD. Rigid or semi-rigid, describe force and counterforce. That's from, actually, I think that's from a policy article. But it's Medicare's wording. They want this information. It seems like a lot of detail. It seems like a little more than maybe you would normally think is necessary, but they're asking for it. So we really got to put it in those notes. Off the shelf is going to be minimal self-adjustment. You would just mention, this is off the shelf, it's size. The patient only needs to adjust the straps as needed. I gave them instructions on sleeping with it or whatever, not sleeping with it. And then the custom fitted requires expert fitting. So that expert fitting is usually substantial modification. So we're going to take that same off-the-shelf brace and we're going to custom fit it to the patient. And Medicare reviewers need to know what that means. What did you do that made it custom fit? So the modification needed to provide an individualized fit to the patient. Again, that is Medicare's wording, right? That is what Medicare wants to see. They want to understand how you provided an individualized fit. So use that wording in your notes as well. And then describe those modifications. I made the modification, I trimmed it over the thigh to accommodate the patient's being able to lean forward, but not too far forward or what have you. Describe the need for the modification. A patient had a colostomy and I had to cut out an area to allow room for the bag or what have you. You had to, cut and mold to accommodate the patient's breasts, things like that, that really, you have to have special tools for. You have to, do certain things that other people who aren't experts would do. So, you had to have a sewing machine. You had to use high heat, which means you had to have special tools. You have anatomical knowledge needed to put the modification in the right area. You have technical knowledge. You know that you can cut and mold over here, but you can't in this area. And you just want to sort of weave that into your note. It doesn't have to be a long thing. You just need to throw in there that you made this modification and it was it had to be done by you because there were special tools involved and special knowledge involved. And then if you're looking at something that's custom fab, this is a little different too. You wouldn't necessarily in the past have described in detail the casting or the scanning of the patient or the measuring, right? But now we need to do that. So what you're going to say, is this, doctor requested custom fab. In order to do that, we cast the patient, standing, supine, whatever you want to say. And then you want to describe your fabrication materials. You want to give a specific detail about the fabrication as well. You really need to make it clear to that reviewer that this is something that you didn't take off the shelf. I used sheet plastic to create this from scratch. I trimmed and modified it over specific anatomy that I had from the scan or from the measurement or from the cast of the patient, etc. Make it very clear. Again, that doesn't mean you have to write 36 pages. It just means you want to highlight clearly, this is what I did, and this is what makes it specific to that patient. So here I would say, if you're writing something about the orthosis was trimmed and modified on the patient to accommodate patient-specific anatomy, that is an incomplete documentation of what was done for the patient. You then need to explain what that weird anatomy was. Did the patient have some sort of scoliotic curve? Mention that, right? Did the patient have, development change, right? Like a tiny, tiny waist and very large hips that don't work, you couldn't accommodate in an off-the-shelf brace. You had to do custom. And then give some measurements of those two. Explain really specifically what about that patient made it necessary so that it doesn't look like you got it off of a template. It doesn't look like you're checking a box. You're really describing what happened with this patient in particular. The last thing you want is for these notes to look the same for every orthosis you put out. Okay, and then this was super cool. When the invite went out for this particular webinar, someone emailed me, Rebecca there, emailed me and said, could you please cover, since you're doing this spinal thing, could you please add into it the Medicare guidelines for delivering an orthosis for a patient that's going to have surgery? And she wanted to know specifically when the orthosis is considered billable to the MAC and when it's billable to the hospital. That's a great question. I get that question so often. I'm really glad she asked it and had me put it in here because I think it's really helpful to know. And that's not necessarily, this isn't necessarily new regulation, but it's constantly confusing, right? And there's always an issue about this thing, this 2-day rule, right? Sounding familiar, right? So I'm not going to read this to you because this is all from the policy article and from the LCD, and it's in your handouts. But the key is to realize that if you're delivering an orthosis, a spinal orthosis or any other orthosis in a Part A stay, right? So to a hospital or a SNF, and they're in a Part A stay, then you can deliver that 2 days before they're discharged, and that right? And that's fine. The issue comes in when they want to use the orthosis during that stay. So you can deliver the orthosis in the Part A stay 2 days before discharge, but the regulation specifically says that if the orthosis is going to be used during that Part A stay, during those 2 days, then you have to bill the hospital, right? So, oh, and someone says, what is the 2-day rule? The 2-day rule is simply if the patient is in a Part A stay that in the hospital or skilled nursing facility and they need an orthosis, you can deliver the orthosis 2 days before they discharge. And that if you do that, you can bill the MAC directly instead of billing the hospital. The hospital loves that because it does that, the cost of that brace won't come out of their per diem payment. So they don't have to pay you out of their set funds. So they love that. You love that because you can not have to deal with getting a PO from the hospital. The hospital's really happy to keep their per diem funds and everybody's loving it. The problem is the hospitals often want it both ways. They want you to give them the brace 2 days before the patient discharges, bill it under the 2-day rule to the max so they don't have to pay, and then they want to use the orthosis in therapy or for the patient before they leave. So the problem comes that you are billing under the 2-day rule, you deliver the brace, it is not supposed to be used, but then the hospital allows their staff, usually the therapist, right, to come in, put the orthosis on the patient, get them up and walk them and say, guess what? He can be discharged because with the brace on, the patient was able to get from bed to toilet, right? Which is often one of the keys for getting discharged, right? So then they go and chart. Yep, had the patient up with the brace on and he was able to get bed to toilet, so we're going to discharge. That's great. Well, that just sunk your 2-day rule billing because now if you bill under the 2-day rule, but that therapist has charted that they use the brace during the Part A stay, now you can't. Now it has to be billed to the hospital. So it usually that's where the issue comes in, right? It's not so much delivering the brace, it's more about the hospital wanting to be able to use it during that Part A, during that 2 days, and that doesn't work. So then someone asks a question, if a patient is covered under a Medicare replacement plan, the patient has surgery and the brace is used, do we bill the hospital or the replacement plan? And it's most of the time those replacement plans are going to follow Medicare guidelines, standard Medicare guidelines. So most of the time, same thing that we just talked about is going to apply there too. Sometimes they don't. And on the rare occasion that happens, you just need to check that individual policy. That's pretty rare that the policy would say something different, but you just need to double check in the policy itself that there isn't some kind of different rule about the 2-day thing. But like I said, most of the time, those are going to have the same coverage. So, okay. So just a quick last word. This was, I think we're right on time. Let's see. Oh yeah, we're early. That's excellent. So a last word would be what I end all of these webinars with, but that's respond, right? This is such a big deal. So especially we're talking about these spinal cases. If you discover that you don't have the doctor's notes you needed, or you got them late, or they're not detailed enough, whatever, and you get an additional documentation request, you absolutely have to send in whatever you have, even if you know it's wrong. Okay, so if you're already in the situation where you've billed it out and you didn't have the notes and they ask for additional documentation request, you have to send in a response. If you don't respond, that's much worse than responding with incorrect information or responding with deficient information. Either way is bad. Either way, you're going to get dinged. Either way, they're going to note that, and it's going to go most likely toward your provider error rate score. That's going to be a problem. But again, you get dinged much worse if you don't respond. Non-response is considered fraud usually, or at the very least, abuse. So you want to be very careful with that. Make sure you respond. And then going forward, make sure that you have what you need in the future so that when you do have to go through an ADR, you're responding with the correct information. Okay. If you have, this was kind of I think this was a provocative webinar in that, that rule about having the order of operations correct can be confusing, and a lot of people feel like they've interpreted the rules differently. That could be the case. If you disagree with me, if you have questions, or if you want me to explain that further, or if you want me to show you exactly where I get this information from policy, then please contact me, send me an email, call me, whatever, and let's discuss it. Or I'm happy to answer any questions or to have a healthy debate about it, whatever you want to do. So that's fine. And then also, again, the code service is not just webinars. You can have your documentation looked at. So if you've got documentation from doctors that you feel like might have the information or isn't quite there, you can send it over to me. You need to mark out identifiers, or if you don't want to do that, you can have a business associate agreement with my company, and then we can do it directly. But otherwise, you can send all that information to me. I'm happy to review it, compare it to policy, and get it back to you with all the information you need to correct it or to help educate the doctor or whatever.